Hi, welcome to Conflict Story, where we bring you the best and most fascinating stories just for you. Let's dive right into one of those stories. It begins like this.
The masks came at dawn like something out of a nightmare. I was standing on my balcony, coffee still steaming in my hands, watching the mist roll off the mountain when I heard the rumble of engines. 4 black SUVs pulled up to my gate, their headlights cutting through the early morning gloom like searchlights. Then came the people in those ridiculous dust masks, looking like they were about to storm a chemical plant instead of bothering a 65-year-old man in his bathrobe. Access to this property is hereby terminated under emergency sanitary protocols. The voice boomed through a bullhorn, shrill and self-important. Karen Hendricks stood at the center of it all, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she held that damn megaphone like it was Excalibur. Behind those dark safety masks, I could see the smug satisfaction in her eyes. Immediate evacuation required due to confirmed gas leaks and explosion hazards. I nearly dropped my coffee. Gas leaks? In a house I'd lived in for 15 years without so much as a flicker from the pilot light? But there they were, 4 men in matching homeowner association jackets, pulling out clipboards and cameras like they owned the place, which apparently they thought they did. "You've got about 10 minutes to grab essentials before we seal the premises," Karen continued, her voice crackling through that bullhorn with the authority of someone who'd never been told no in her life. "Safety protocols, you understand. We're doing this for the good of the community." I stood there in my old Navy bathrobe, watching my neighbors gather on the sidewalk like it was some kind of morning entertainment. Mrs. Patterson from next door had her arms crossed, shaking her head with that look people get when they're witnessing someone else's misfortune and feeling grateful it's not theirs. The Johnsons were whispering to each other, probably already planning how they'd tell this story at the next block party. The funny thing about crisis is how it strips away all the comfortable lies you tell yourself. I'd always thought I was the kind of man who'd stand his ground, who'd fight back against injustice with both fists swinging, but standing there in my bathrobe, watching strangers in masks ransack through my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Vietnam. Complete, overwhelming helplessness. They moved through my house like locusts. One of them, a thin guy with nervous eyes above his mask, started pulling my belongings into black contractor bags. My wife Margaret's china went in first, the set we'd bought for our 25th anniversary. Then came the photo albums, 40 years of memories reduced to potential evidence in whatever game Karen was playing. "Careful with those," I said, my voice hoarse with something between rage and despair. The thin guy, his name tag read Danny, actually looked apologetic for a second, before Karen's voice cut through the morning air again. "Everything needs to be cataloged and removed pending environmental testing," she announced to the gathering crowd. "We've received reports of hazardous material storage, potential chemical contamination. The safety of this community is our primary concern." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Hazardous materials? The most dangerous thing in my house was probably the bottle of bleach under the kitchen sink. But nobody was laughing. The crowd was eating it up, nodding along like Karen was delivering the gospel truth instead of whatever fever dream she'd cooked up in that power-hungry brain of hers. That's when I saw Frank Morrison push through the crowd. Frank had been my friend since we'd both moved to this neighborhood in the 80s. We'd shared beers, fixed each other's fences, complained about property taxes and politicians. If anyone would see through this charade, it would be Frank. "This is ridiculous, Karen," Frank called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent 30 years as a foreman at the steel plant. "Joe's been living here longer than most of us. There's nothing dangerous about his place." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone with sense. But Karen turned that megaphone on Frank like she was aiming a weapon. "Frank Morrison, isn't it? Unit 247? Her voice dropped to a conversational tone that somehow sounded more threatening than all the shouting. "I believe we've been meaning to have a conversation about that old grain silo on your property. The one that's been leaning dangerously toward the Henderson Children's Playground." The color drained from Frank's face. I watched my oldest friend in this neighborhood look from me to Karen, then back to me, and I saw the exact moment he made his choice. His shoulders sagged like someone had cut his strings. Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding, he mumbled, backing away from the crowd. I'm sure you folks know what you're doing. And just like that, my last ally disappeared into the crowd of faces, leaving me alone with my coffee growing cold and my dignity scattered across the lawn in black plastic bags. The men in masks worked with the efficiency of professionals, loading everything I owned into the back of a utility trailer marked environmental hazard removal. Karen approached me then, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixing with the morning dew. She lowered the megaphone and leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. You never should have complained about the new community center project, Joe. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. We're just looking out for everyone's safety. I'm sure you understand. I understood all right. This wasn't about gas leaks or environmental hazards. This was about power, pure and simple. Karen had found a way to eliminate opposition, and she was using the homeowner association like her personal army. The masks, the official-sounding protocols, the talk of community safety, it was all theater, designed to make her petty revenge look like civic responsibility. By noon, I was standing on the sidewalk with a hastily packed duffel bag, watching them seal my front door with yellow tape like it was a crime scene. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but I could feel eyes watching from behind curtains and partially closed blinds. I'd become the neighborhood pariah in less than 6 hours, transformed from Joe the quiet retiree who kept his lawn neat and helped his neighbors with their computers into Joe the potential terrorist with his secret stash of mysterious chemicals. The trailer full of my belongings disappeared around the corner, taking 40 years of accumulated life with it. Photos of Margaret before the cancer took her, my discharge papers from the Navy, the flag they'd given me at her funeral, all of it gone, reduced to potential evidence in Karen's manufactured crisis. I spent that first night in the Motel 6 on the highway, listening to the traffic and wondering how everything had gone wrong so fast. The room smelled like industrial disinfectant and defeat, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see Karen's satisfied smile and Frank's retreating figure. But lying there in that narrow bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, I felt something else growing alongside the anger and humiliation. It was cold and patient, like the feeling I used to get in the service when we knew the enemy was close but couldn't see them yet. Karen thought she'd won, thought she'd scared me into submission with her little show of force. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The social workers arrived on Tuesday morning like vultures dressed in pastel cardigans. I was sitting in that cramped motel room, trying to figure out my next move, when the knock came, 2 women with clipboards and sympathetic smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Mr. Henderson, I'm Susan Walsh from Adult Protective Services, and this is Dr. Patricia Reeves from the County Health Department. The older one, Walsh, had the kind of voice people use when talking to children or the mentally impaired. We understand you've been displaced from your home due to safety concerns. I should have slammed the door right then. Should have told them to take their concerns and file them somewhere the sun doesn't shine. But I was tired, confused, and still reeling from watching my life get packed into garbage bags. So I let them in, and that was my first mistake. Dr. Reeves pulled out a tablet and started tapping away, while Walsh settled into the room's single chair like she owned it. We've reviewed the preliminary reports from the homeowner association, she began, consulting her notes. There are some concerns about your ability to maintain safe living conditions. The presence of hazardous materials, potential hoarding behaviors. Hoarding? I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice. Lady, my house was cleaner than most restaurants, and those hazardous materials were a can of WD-40 and some old paint in the garage. But they weren't listening. Not really, they had their narrative already written, and I was just supposed to play along. Dr. Reeves leaned forward with that practiced expression of concern that probably worked wonders on confused elderly patients. Mr. Henderson, we're not here to judge. We're here to help. There are some lovely assisted living facilities in the area, places where you wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance or much property management. Think of it as a well-deserved retirement from all those responsibilities. The pills came out next. A small bottle of something called sertraline, along with pamphlets about managing anxiety in seniors and coping with major life transitions. They spoke in gentle, condescending tones about cognitive assessments and temporary guardianship, about the importance of accepting help when you can no longer manage on your own. I took the pills because it was easier than fighting. I nodded when they talked about evaluation periods and safety protocols. I even signed some papers, though I couldn't tell you what they said through the fog of rage and exhaustion that had settled over my brain like smoke. By Thursday, I was living in a FEMA trailer parked at the edge of town, close enough to see my house, but far enough away to feel like an exile in my own neighborhood. The trailer smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams, and every night I could hear the sounds of celebration drifting from the direction of my former home. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just evicting me. She was erasing me, moving into my house like some kind of conquering general, throwing parties for the neighbors who'd stood by and watched while she destroyed my life. The yellow tape was gone from my front door, replaced by string lights and potted plants that definitely hadn't been there when I left. Frank found me on Friday evening, sitting on the trailer's fold-out steps and watching the sunset paint the mountains the color of old blood. He brought a six-pack of beer and enough guilt to choke a horse. Joe, He cracked open a can and stared at it like it held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I should have stood up for you. Should have said something. I wanted to hate him. Part of me did hate him. The part that remembered 40 years of friendship evaporating the moment Karen pointed that metaphorical gun at his own property. But sitting there in the growing darkness, listening to the distant sound of laughter from my stolen home, I found I was too tired for hatred. They threatened the grain silo, Frank continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Said if I didn't stay out of it, they'd file a complaint with the county. Code violations, safety hazards. They had a whole list ready. I couldn't risk losing everything, Joe. Mary's medical bills, the grandkids' college fund. I couldn't risk it. That's when I understood the true genius of Karen's operation. She hadn't just attacked me. She'd weaponized the entire system against anyone who might oppose her. Every neighbor had something to lose, some violation or vulnerability she could exploit. She'd turned the homeowner association into her personal protection racket, using fear and bureaucracy instead of baseball bats and broken kneecaps. I found some of your stuff, Frank said, pulling out a manila envelope. Photos, documents, some of Margaret's jewelry. I grabbed what I could before they loaded the truck. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. There was our wedding photo, Margaret's engagement ring, my father's Purple Heart from Korea. Small things, but they felt like pieces of my soul being handed back to me from the grave. I clutched them against my chest and felt something break open inside me that I'd been holding closed since this nightmare began. Frank, I said, my voice rough with emotions I couldn't name, I need you to do something for me, something that might get us both in trouble. He looked at me with eyes that held 40 years of shared history, of borrowed tools and shared sorrows, and the kind of friendship that survives everything except cowardice. What do you need? The plan was simple, maybe too simple, but sometimes the best strategies are the ones nobody expects because they're too obvious to see. I'd spent 3 days watching Karen's routine from my exile in the trailer. She left the house every morning at 9:30 for her yoga class, returned at 11 for her coffee and correspondence, then headed out again at 2 for her community outreach activities, which mostly involved harassing other residents into compliance with her ever-expanding list of regulations. During that 2-hour window between 11 and 1, she held court in what used to be my living room, meeting with other homeowner association board members and planning new ways to make everyone's life miserable. Frank had been invited to one of these meetings, his grain silo situation making him a person of interest, and he'd agreed to be my eyes and ears inside. The recorder was tiny, no bigger than a thumb drive, and it nestled perfectly inside the fake plant I'd bought at the dollar store. Frank would place it during the meeting, let it run for the full 2 hours, then retrieve it when Karen stepped out to take her inevitable phone call to her lawyer about some new resident to terrorize. "You sure about this?" Frank asked as we sat in his truck at the edge of the trailer park, the fake plant between us on the bench seat. "If she catches me—" "She won't," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "Karen's too busy performing for her audience to notice details. Just place it, sit through the meeting, grab it when she's distracted, and walk away. Simple as that." But nothing about this situation was simple, and we both knew it. We were two old men playing spy games against someone who held all the cards and made all the rules. One mistake, and Frank would be the next one living in a trailer while Karen threw parties in his house. Monday morning came gray and cold, with the kind of drizzle that makes everything look like a funeral. I watched from my trailer window as Frank's pickup disappeared around the bend toward my house, toward the meeting that would either give us the ammunition we needed or destroy the last friend I had left in this world. The waiting was the hardest part. I cleaned the trailer 3 times, organized my rescued belongings into neat piles, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. At 12:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Package delivered." At 1:15, "Package retrieved." At 2 o'clock, Frank knocked on my trailer door with a smile that could have powered the whole town. "Joe," he said, holding up that tiny recorder like it was made of solid gold, "you're going to want to hear this." Karen's voice came through crystal clear as Frank and I huddled around the tiny speaker in my trailer that evening. She wasn't just admitting to the manufactured crisis. She was bragging about it, laying out her entire strategy like some kind of suburban Napoleon explaining her conquest to her generals. "The beauty of the safety protocol angle," her voice crackled from the device, "is that nobody questions it. You mention gas leaks or environmental hazards, and suddenly everyone's too scared to ask for proof. It's all about controlling the narrative." Board member voices chimed in with approval, asking about next steps and future targets. Someone mentioned the Kowalski family and their excessive garden gnomes. Another voice suggested going after the elderly woman on Pine Street, whose late husband's workshop was clearly a fire hazard. But it was Karen's next words that made my blood run cold. "The Henderson situation proves the model works perfectly. One manufactured crisis, some official-looking paperwork, a few strategic threats to potential allies, and boom, problem solved. We can use this template anywhere we need compliance." Frank looked at me across the narrow trailer space, his face pale in the lamplight. "Jesus, Joe, she's talking about doing this to other people. This isn't just about you anymore." That's when it hit me. This wasn't revenge, it was a test run. Karen had used me as a guinea pig to perfect her system of control, and now she was planning to roll it out neighborhood-wide. Every person who'd ever questioned a board decision, every resident who's dared to maintain their property according to their own standards instead of her arbitrary rules, was now a potential target. The old anger flared up again, but this time it was different, cleaner, focused. This wasn't about getting my house back anymore. It was about stopping a predator before she could destroy more lives. "Frank," I said, ejecting the memory card from the recorder, "how many people do you think would be interested in hearing this?" The answer, it turned out, was more than we could have imagined. Frank started with his immediate neighbors, the families most likely to be Karen's next targets. I contacted the veterans group I'd neglected since Margaret's death, men and women who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Word spread through the informal networks that exist in every small community, the coffee shop conversations, the grocery store encounters, the chance meetings at the post office. By Wednesday, we had 23 people who wanted copies of the recording. By Friday, that number had grown to 47. These weren't activists or troublemakers. They were ordinary people who'd been living under Karen's increasingly authoritarian rule and finally had proof of what they'd always suspected. The genius of it was that we didn't organize anything. No meetings, no protests, no official resistance. We just made sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person was running their homeowner association. The recording spoke for itself, Karen's own words condemning her more effectively than any accusation we could have made. The storm broke on Saturday morning. I was sitting on my trailer steps, drinking coffee and watching the morning mist roll off the mountains when I heard the commotion. Voices raised in anger, car doors slamming, the sound of Karen's bullhorn trying to restore order to a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond her control. Frank appeared at my side, breathless with excitement. "Joe, you've got to see this. The whole neighborhood's at your house. Everyone's there." We drove to the edge of my former property and parked where we could observe without being seen. What I witnessed was more beautiful than any sunrise I'd ever watched from that mountain balcony. Karen stood on my front porch, with her bullhorn and her clipboard, trying to address a crowd that was having none of it. But this wasn't the compliant audience she'd grown accustomed to. These were angry people who'd heard her voice on that recording, describing them as problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. "The safety protocols are clearly defined in your association handbook," Karen insisted, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining authority. "Any resident who poses a potential hazard to the community must be evaluated according to established procedures." "Whose procedures?" shouted Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who'd watched my eviction with quiet satisfaction just days earlier. "Your made-up procedures, the ones you invented to get rid of people who disagree with you." That's when Karen made her fatal mistake. Instead of backing down, instead of trying to explain or deflect, she doubled down with all the arrogance that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. "I don't have to justify association policy to residents who clearly don't understand the complexities of community management," she snapped, raising the bullhorn to amplify her condescension. "If you have concerns about board decisions, you can file them through proper channels and wait for a response like everyone else." The crowd erupted. 47 people who'd spent years swallowing Karen's arbitrary rules and invasive inspections and petty tyrannies suddenly found their voices all at once. They weren't shouting about gas leaks or environmental hazards. They were shouting about dignity, about the right to live in their own homes without fear, about the difference between community standards and personal vendettas. I watched Karen's face transform as she realized what was happening. The confident smile faded, replaced by something I'd never seen there before, genuine fear. For the first time in years, maybe decades, she was facing consequences for her actions. The bullhorn slipped from her fingers and clattered onto my front porch as the crowd pressed closer. Not threatening, not violent, but united in a way she'd never allowed them to be before. Someone started chanting, "Karen must go," and others picked it up until the words echoed off the mountains like a war cry. By noon, it was over. Karen left in her white SUV with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, driving away from a neighborhood that had finally learned to say no. The association board held an emergency meeting that afternoon and voted unanimously to void all safety protocol evictions and return seized property to its rightful owners. I moved back into my house that evening, but it felt different somehow. Smaller. The walls had absorbed too much anger, too much violation, to ever feel completely safe again. My belongings had been returned, but they were scattered in boxes throughout rooms that no longer felt entirely mine. Frank helped me unpack, both of us working in companionable silence as the sun set behind the mountains. When we finished, he cracked open a beer and handed it to me with a smile that held relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "So what now?" he asked, settling into the chair where Karen had held her morning court sessions just days earlier. I looked around at my reclaimed living room, at the photos of Margaret back on their shelves and my father's Purple Heart in its place of honor on the mantelpiece. I thought about the recording that had brought down a tyrant, about the neighbors who'd found their courage when it mattered most, about the price of fighting back in a world where power too often goes unchallenged. Now, I took a long drink of cold beer and felt something settle in my chest, Something that might have been peace or might have been exhaustion. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Now, we make sure it never happens again. Outside my window, the neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of children playing in yards their parents no longer had to worry about defending. It wasn't the victory I'd imagined when this all started. There were no parades, no dramatic confessions, no moment of perfect justice that made all the suffering worthwhile. But Karen was gone, and the recording of her own words would follow her wherever she tried to rebuild her little empire of control. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the only victory worth having is the one that protects the next person from going through what you survived. I raised my beer in a silent toast to Margaret, to my father, to everyone who'd ever had to choose between standing up and staying safe. The mountains stood eternal in the growing darkness, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was home.